Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today on our Biosimilars Overview and Policy Landscape webinar. This is the first and what I'm hoping to be a regular webinar series that the Medical Society is going to be putting on, some that we produce directly, some that we get from partners, and really just an attempt to add some value to your practice in various different ways. Today's very much a policy and a practice solution they can have. Other one, our next one is going to be a tax and finance, both running practices and your own personal finances for those who are in large systems and groups. There's a lot of opportunities and need in that area. Let me introduce myself. For those of you who don't know, I'm Paul Hedgie. I'm the CEO of the San Diego County Med Society. I've been here for about 5.5 years and had been at the California Medical Association for 5 years before that. Originally as a lobbyist and advocate, and then in other management roles more into the operations side. After I finished up some intros here, I'll ask our panelists to introduce themselves, and then Dr. Singh to start off with a planned presentation with the slide deck. Today's program is intended to be an overview of current policy landscape of biosimilars, regulatory framework, general requirements, and key concepts and developmental processes that we have with biosimilars. We'll do a little education at the front end about where biosimilars are, and then we also have an expert in where they can be used in your practice. I have a pretty fundamental belief in health policy, in that everybody knows the costs of healthcare are growing in an untenable way. It's untenable for patients, it's untenable for businesses that pay insurance, and it's untenable for governments, which is I think the real danger. Because at some point, if you look at the higher and higher percentages that healthcare costs in government budgets, at some point they're going to come and say, we're not doing that anymore. We have other higher priorities. And my fear of that is if we as the physician community aren't part of that solution, they're going to come after us more than others. And so I think just strategy-wise, it's incumbent on the physician community to help be part of the solution, to help find ways that we can save money in healthcare while still delivering top quality healthcare for our patients. And I think biosimilars is one example of that, as a way that we can be making a difference for our patients, saving money, and hopefully, one piece of helping the system overall. San Diego County Med Society has been a leader on this issue. In some ways, we authored a resolution last year with the California Medical Association advocating for higher take-up of biosimilars at the state level and advocating to the state to implement some of those. I believe Dr. Singh published a op-ed on the subject last year as well. So we're by no means, revolutionary on this, but we're trying to do our part and be active in this topic. With that, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. And Robert, why don't you start first?
Thank you for having me, actually, for this important conference. I'm Robert Pavlov. I'm currently Chief Science Policy Officer at the Global Healthy Living Foundation and a Senior Health Policy Fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute. Prior to this job, I was at Pfizer for over 2 decades. Latest job was a Vice President at the U.S. Government Relations. And Pfizer, that's where I got involved with the biosimilars and the development of the launch of the biosimilars, as well as, I was a board member of the Biosimilars Forum, which is an advocacy organization, a coalition organization of companies that make biosimilars. And I was very much involved in both state and federal lobbying and policy issues regarding how to basically create an environment, like you said, Paul, to have an uptake of biosimilars, which is really something that we've needed for a long time, actually, and we're a decade behind it from Europe. And the reason we've needed it is because these drugs have been around for a long time, these biologics, and they're very important medicines. They're for treatment of cancers and autoimmune disorders and cancer support care. And now we have alternatives that are lower cost alternatives, and we need to create an environment that there's efforts to utilize them more often than not. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rebecca, I'm going to toss to you here in a second. Welcome. muted, Rebecca.
There you go. Is that better?
Perfect.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Candelian. Now there's an echo.
You seem pretty clear to me.
Okay, maybe just on my end. I'm a clinical pharmacist by training. I'm a drug education coordinator at the Kaiser San Diego service area and essentially co-oversee the drug utilization management team and responsible for cost and quality and safety of medications. And biologics make up a huge percentage of our drug spend. And so biosimilars is a pretty big strategy for us to, like Paul said, use drugs in a more cost-effective way without really impacting quality. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Perfect. I really appreciate you joining us, and I'm hoping to bring that experience for physicians that aren't in a big system like yours so that they can learn where they can use these biosimilars in their practices with their patients that maybe they don't come across in other ways. And finally, let's bring in Dr. Singh, and then we will go from your intro into your presentation as well.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you very much, Will Singh. I've been with the Preventative Medical Group for the past 20 years now, and with the Medical Society for at least 15 to 17 years. Jokingly aside, back then when we were talking about the growth of healthcare, we were looking at the healthcare costs, and look, if it kept growing at this rate, in about 70 years, the rate of healthcare, the cost of healthcare will equal GDP, which means either be a patient or a physician. I mean, that growth is unsustainable. So this is a big part, and thank you for inviting me to discuss how can we, again, deliver the same quality of care with affordable costs. So with that, let me jump right into it. Give me one second.
Yeah, as I come out, I'm going to let everybody know we have the question and answer function open. So if you want to post questions there, when we get to the panel system after this presentation, I will try to pull from that as well as some other discussion topics we have.
Okay, so can you see the presentation?
Yep.
All right. So just start off, I mean, we talked about the cost. What is the actual cost? Biologics account for 43% of the total US medication spend, reaching $211 billion in 2019. It's growing at a compounded rate of 14.6% versus 1.6% for small molecules. So,
Dr. Singh, can I pause you? Your audio is a little poor right now.
Oh, let me just see. Give me 1 second, then let me try to get off the.
Can't hear you at all now.
Can you hear me now?
Great.
Okay, so I'm gonna just get off my headphones and get back into here. Okay, are we back on? All right, so again, biologics cost about 43% of total spend. So that's a huge amount, $211 billion with a compounded rate of 14.6%. And we're thinking 7% healthcare growth is unsustainable. This is twice of that. And nobody really looks at it. Compare the 14.6 to 1.6 for a small molecule, which is traditional medications that we take. Really, it's a huge amount, and that is only growing faster and faster. So just to say, best way to describe it that I saw online really is to say, why is it cost so much, and why can't we just reverse engineer this thing? And small molecules like aspirin or ibuprofen or even Lipitor or anything like that, reverse engineering that is fairly easy. It's like saying, I'm taking a bike and I'm making a copy of the bike. You can pretty much make the exact same bike with very little cost, like aspirin, right? 21 atoms, that's it. But with biologics, these are made from live organisms that produce medication. So it's almost like saying, hey, here's a picture of the picture, not even the components. Here's a picture of the F-16 jet. Now I want you to reverse engineer and make that thing. So it is definitely scales beyond the complexity of just making a doubles of it. Now, generics versus biologics. You know, generics can reach up to, it can take up to 2 to 3 years for generic medications to get a market. But biosimilar depends, it goes approximately 7 to 8 years to reach the market. You know, biosimilars are highly similar. They're not exact copies, whereas generics are exact copies. So these things can be more complex to make and to replicate. And here's kind of where things all started. Biologic Price Competition and Innovation Act, BPCIA. This is an amazing law that was passed in March 2010. This was the place where we started allowing for increased use of biosimilars. Okay, whereas European Union started in 2005, so they had about 5 years ahead of us. Now, what is that date, March 2010? Why does that sound so familiar? So for those of us who have been in this healthcare field for a long time, we will recognize that year very clearly as alpaca or PPACA, right? This was the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act that most of us got wrong at the very beginning, alpaca, whatever it is. But it ended up being shortened to Affordable Care Act, or ACA, or Obamacare. And it's all started with this picture, right? This was President Obama standing by a lot of powerful people at that time, Cedars-Sinai, Merck, Kaiser Health Plan, Medical AMA, SEIU, and Life Sciences, Edward of Life Sciences. So these were all key players that went into help developing the ACA. And with PPACA, really it was signed onto law on March 23rd, 2010. And together with the Healthcare and Educational Reconciliation Act, is one of the biggest overhaul in terms of healthcare and Medicare and Medicaid. And we always talked about, was it really a healthcare transformation or was it a health finance transformation? And it did both, but mostly health finance. And part of that is, how do we control the cost? How do we make sure that we place into some law or some act to make sure we're looking at the cost as well? So back to this biologic BPCIA. So back to this this act. Essentially, we were 5 years behind already, and the product, the biologic product, has to be highly similar to the reference product or the original product, and notwithstanding minor differences. Because again, you can't make an exact copy unless you have the exact organism that produced this biologic product. So what we're looking at is having no clinical meaningful difference between the biological product and the reference product. So the approval pathway for traditional medication, really, it's just making sure that you go through the phase 1, 2, 3, phase 3 studies as well. And for the biologics, it's through the 351A or PHS Act. Again, phase 1, 2, 3 study, and phase 3 for new indication. But there are abbreviated approval pathways for generics or traditional drugs and biosimilars. So this is the pathway that was made so that we can make generics, and instead of generics for biologics, it's called biosimilars, right? Generics, because it's an exact replica, it really is looking at, does it deliver the same amount of medication in the body? Whereas biologics is a little different because you're not creating the exact same copy. You have to do analytical studies, animal studies, and clinical trials to make sure that there's no difference in clinical outcome. So with the biosimilars, it's a different way of measuring similarity instead of exact copies. So there's 5 key concepts that the FDA came up with. Again, for standalone, which is the original product or the reference product, how does that compare to the biosimilars? Because again, biosimilars are just looking at similarity. They're not looking at an exact pathway to develop a new drug. And again, it's demonstrating biosimilarity and interchangeability. Now, interchangeability is also another key word. Interchangeability is where you can actually say this drug can be exchanged for the original drug without any permission, or so things like if I said I wanted Lipitor, it's exact same thing as atorvastatin. So you don't need another script or another permission to make that switch. Whereas biologics, you still need to, unless it's been deemed as an interchangeable drug. If it gets to that status, then you can actually switch out the biosimilars. However, at this point, we don't have any biosimilar medications that are deemed interchangeable. Right now, it's still considered biosimilar. We haven't gotten to that exact copy yet. So concept number 2 from FDA, really this is to take a stepwise approach. So looking at the way biosimilars work, when you're doing the studies to develop a biosimilar type medication, you really base your next step on what came beforehand. So first you look at the analytical structure, look at the similarity, you look at all the different type of steps you've done in terms of due diligence for the medication, meaning comparing the analytical studies, looking at the animal studies, looking at the comparative PK or pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic studies, making sure the human clinical studies are all the same. So by looking at all those things, you base on your next study on how successful or what the data shows in the previous study. So it's a stepwise evidence development. You base your next study on what came beforehand. Key concept number 3 is analytic similarity data is the foundation of biosimilars. So again, the way biosimilars works or biologics work is basically looking at how the protein or the product attaches to certain receptors, right? It's like the key and the door lock concept. How similar is the key? How similar in structure, in shape, its function, its attachment? How similar is analytically, how similar is this structure? And then you build up from that point on. And so, and because of that, the analytical box, that triangle is the biggest one, because it looks at the physical, chemical, functional characteristics. It looks at the primary amino acid sequencing, the post-translational modification, heterogeneity, and basically biological activity as well. So the analysis of the structure and the chemicals is really the largest component of development of a biosimilar medication. All right, and then key concept number 4. Clinical studies are looking at making sure that, hey, this medication that you've developed is not clinically different from the reference or original product. So that's what they're looking at. They're not looking at the effectiveness. They're looking to make sure that there is no significant difference. And then the 5th concept, which is interesting, is the extrapolation of indication. So whereas one product may be able to use for 3 or 5 diseases, once you have found the similarity to one of the indications, you can extrapolate that indication into all the rest of the disease burden. So if one medication can treat 4 diseases, as long as you can prove that the biosimilar medication can be effective and no difference from the reference or the original product in one of the diseases, you can actually extrapolate that. So those are the 5 key concepts. So in summary of the first part, development of this biosimilar is very different from standalone development, where you have to, even though it's a slightly different product, you don't start from the very beginning. You can base it on what the original or reference product has done already. The development goal is not to reestablish the safety and effectiveness. It's really looking at, is there any clinically difference from the original product? The analytical comparison of the foundation to see that it's very similar, the PD or PK or PD actually, is most sensitive in terms of detecting differences. Assessment of immunogenicity is needed, and comparative clinical data collected if there's any other questions remain. And approval of biosimilar is based on totality of the evidence, so looking at the entire picture rather than just pieces of it. And again, it's still based on high standards as any other therapy. Oh, and I think and then the interchangeable, the name, the way they make the name is really odd, and I'll let Rebecca talk about that a little later. So what do we have available in the US? Now we have 29 biosimilars currently approved. And again, because we were 5 years behind, Europe has 58 already, with 16 reference product where we only have 9 at this time. And on the right, it shows the indications for the reference product just for clinicians to reference. And then what's the impact of biologicals in the market? You know, automatically alone, biologics gives you a kind of a rate that's about 30% lower. So you automatically, once getting from the start, you have a significant decrease in price. And having this pathway increases innovations and also increases patient access, because it's been proven by the time it comes out that there is no clinical difference between that and the reference product. The savings alone is in 2019 is 2.2 billion, which is about what we get from the tobacco tax. So, I mean, imagine that going back into the healthcare, and cumulative of 4.5 billion since the initiation of this. But we also have a lost opportunity of 9.8 billion. So there's a lot of savings that we can for our patients and our society actually. And right now, the uptake of newer biosimilars seems to be much faster than that of prior biosimilars. So I think people are starting to understand what biosimilars are and how they work, and hopefully we can convince more people to consider biosimilars. So the way you look at this graph is the ones that were started in 2016, so infliximab, you see the uptake through the years. It took a long time to get to 6%. Whereas the newer medications, like the one in the blue, really at 2019, it's already been, the uptake is already up to 42%. So the older drugs seem to have a longer ramp-up time in terms of uptake, whereas the newer medication seems to be faster. So I think a lot of this is education and understanding what biologics are. So I'm hoping that as time moves further on, we will be using more biosimilars in the future. And when they looked at the barriers, prescriber barriers, they looked at the survey from prescribers' perspective. Surveys indicate that low confidence is a reason for not prescribing, doubts about the safety and efficacy, and concerns of immunogenicity and risk of biosimilars versus the original reference drug. And from a patient's understanding, really, they just don't know what biosimilars are. They do have concerns about efficacy and affordability, so that's a big one, affordability. And they really want to know more about the decision making. And from a adoption payer policy, really the coverage of biologic varies among different payers, and it's also put in the same way as other medications when it comes to pharmacy benefit managers, and that can be a incentive to actually use the more costly medication because you get more rebates. So there's a whole complicated regimen on how our pharmacy is being prescribed. So again, that's from a adoption and a payer perspective. So a lot of this really comes down to education and understanding.
I see Robert reacting
that you guys are here to kind of learn and about this, and hopefully be able to start being more comfortable using this. And communication with patients or prior to implementation is also important. Collaboration between the prescriber and the pharmacist is helpful, and continue an ongoing monitoring of safety, effectiveness, and formulary designs, again, promoting the use of biosimilars versus the reference product. So, the big picture really is that the cost driver for biologics are just unsustainable at 14%. There are better options here that are just as safe, works just as well. And if we want to be part of the solution, we need to put this in there and understand and better utilize our healthcare dollars that our patients give us.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much, Dr.
This
Singh.
QA.
If you can close up that presentation. There we go. Stop sharing your screen, please. There we go. I got that. Okay. I'm not sure if you can hear me, Dr.
Paul, I
Singh,
can't
but
hear you.
yeah, that's on you. I'm gonna go. That's a problem we can figure out later for you. I saw you react, Robert, to some of his comments there at the end. I'm just gonna pass it right to you. He blew through a lot of the stuff I want to ask you, but I know you can ask a lot more on it. So
yeah, well, let me start with reacting to a couple of the comments. So I'm always glad to see my study being referenced in a talk. So it's always good to see that your literature that you actually publish, people are reading and using it in their presentations. So that's a good thing. It has to do with the survey of the physicians that showed how they need more comfort with biosimilars. So without a doubt, I mean, the barriers to access is the biggest thing that we need to talk about, because the reality is that there are issues and specific barriers that we need to address, and they go way beyond just education and making people comfortable with biosimilars. I think that's the first thing that we need to do, and we showed that through the surveys and the studies that have been published, is that physicians, the pharmacists, the healthcare professionals in general, and patients need to be comfortable with this new class of agents. But we've been talking about education for a long time, and it's an open-ended question that I think it's important to focus on, but it's not the sole thing that's creating a barrier for biosimilar adoption. So what are the other things? Number one, I think alluded to it at the end, is rebate contracting. It's really a barrier in the marketplace. It's not a barrier in Kaiser as he practices or where Rebecca practices. The reason being is that you guys don't use rebate contracting. You don't have a pharmacy benefit manager that negotiates. So rebate contracting, and you may have heard of a term called rebate wall, is a reality. Majority of the formularies in the United States are constructed based on collection of rebates and not efficacy and safety. That's a big ruse that's been provided to the population, that formularies are based on safety and efficacy. That is not true. It's primarily to basically get rebates. And as it was alluded to, the higher the price of medicines, the higher the rebates, and the less of an incentive for the pharmacy benefit manager, which keeps a percentage of that, and not only a percentage of the rebates, but also the fees and everything else that they collect on top of that, to have incentives to cover lower cost alternatives. And we've seen this in real time in Remicade, in the Remicade Inflectra Renflexis world that it was alluded to. The reason that uptake has been so dismal is because you're talking about a class of drugs that is not used for a certain period of time, like oncology drugs or not supportive care drugs. They're chronic medicines that patients are placed on lifetime, and they are very sticky, and they're very much, there are barriers regarding how rebates and rebate contracting constrict the access to those medicines. And that is why you see words like rebate wall talked about. So that's the number one thing. I think that's without a doubt with the chronic use medicines, especially in the Remicade space, and we can get into why oncology is done so well, is really because these drugs have a high rebate level. They have dominant market positions. And when a product has a dominant market position and provides a lot of rebates, it's impossible for the PBMs to turn away from that drug, because the whole purpose of their existence is to collect rebates and profit from that. So that's number one barrier that needs to be addressed. The second thing is patient incentives and physician incentives. There aren't any in existence. There is no differential in out-of-pocket costs with biologics or the originator or the biosimilars, so patients don't feel the pain. So there is no incentive for them to do it the way that formularies are constructed, especially in the infusion arm, with the physician administered drugs, not as much in the retail drugs. And we'll get to that because we don't have any biosimilars yet in the retail space. And the second thing is physician incentives. There are no incentives for physicians to administer the lower cost alternatives other than a goodwill or being in positions where the market is capitated or the payments are capitated. So they do use then lower cost alternatives. So hence, you need to create incentives for physicians like sharing the savings for them to be able to pick up these medicines and utilize them instead of the originator drugs. And same thing with patients. And the last thing I would say, the biggest, another barrier that hopefully Dr. Singh and Rebecca play a role in is misinformation. I mean, the biologic originator companies did a great job of providing a lot of false information about what biosimilars are and aren't. And I'll give you one example. The issue of interchangeability came up. Interchangeability is really a designation that was provided by the FDA for the purposes of substitution by the pharmacist without any permission from a physician. That's all it is. It doesn't reflect on the safety or efficacy of the medicine. And FDA made it very clear. Unfortunately, the interchangeability designation was originally turned around by some of those companies and working with the insurance companies and turned into something that wasn't, which is really reflecting the safety and efficacy of these medicines. It is important to note that the biosimilars in general don't have a separate label. They get the label of the originator. In fact, if you look up the biosimilar label for Inflectra or Renflexis or any of the biosimilars, it's basically the originator's label because the FDA feels that they are similarities, and that's how biosimilars were developed. So I will stop there, and then we can get into further discussion on some of the other topics.
Perfect. And I'm going to bring you in, Rebecca, because there's been a few references from both Dr. Singh's material as well as what Robert said. I think you can give some more practical use of that. So why don't you take the floor for a moment, and then we'll bring everybody on. Uh-oh. Now I don't have sound from you, and you're not muted. Want to try again? Oh, okay. Says you're connected now.
Is this any better?
Yeah.
Yes. Perfect.
Yeah.
I think I'm gonna, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, you're great.
I think I'm gonna get rid of my headset also.
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay. One of the things that Robert mentioned that struck a chord was the concept of if it's for chronic use, it's a little bit more difficult than if it's for more acute use to convince the patients and the providers. And I think that was one of the things we saw with Inflectra, which was one of the biosimilars for Remicade. And that was our first chronic, biosimilar switch. And it was really, there was a lot of education that was done both on the provider end and the patient end to reassure them that you're not going to feel different. And it is a disease, it's a disease that's got a high disease burden. And so nobody really wanted to switch their medications when things are going well. And so that was probably our toughest biosimilar switch. After that, the bevacizumab and the Herceptin, that those have been much easier switches because first patients don't stay on them for a long time. And I think as a whole, as a system, we became more used to using biosimilars and everything that's associated with it, which has been just lower costs and really no difference in quality or efficacy.
Yeah, I would just say I was going to say from a physician's standpoint, we have a very good relationship with the pharmacy, and from physicians, I just want something to work. I just want something for my patients that will treat what they have and their burden. So, the education component to me is not the details of the medication, how it works and how it's similar. but the clinical differences. So bringing the clinical aspect to education is really what helps us accept the medication much easier. And because we have such a close relationship, we get the education all the time from the pharmacist. It makes it easy for us to trust and work with each other. And I think that's what works well.
Your system is known as a high user of biosimilars. How have you gone about doing that? And you touch a little more on that education, both kind of, I guess, on the patient side and on the provider side, the physician side.
It's no different than any other therapeutic substitution at this point, but maybe earlier in our journey with the biosimilars, I would reach out to the provider groups that are utilizing that biosimilar. So for instance, in the case of Remicade, it was rheumatology, gastroenterology, and a little bit of dermatology. And so I would go and present the clinical trials that led to the approval of the biosimilar and say, hey, look, it was studied in RA, but there's the concept of extrapolation, and we saw no clinically significant differences between the medications or the outcomes. And so it's basically just a primer on what biosimilars are, what the specifics are for that drug, and just the reassurance that we were going to educate the patients. And so we had long discussions about what that would entail with the resources that we had and a huge population of patients that had to be switched. And so I think every service area did a little bit of a different approach depending on their areas, providers' comfort level and needs. We sent out letters to patients explaining prior to their infusion what biosimilars are. We had a phone number for them to call to ask questions about biosimilars, which many of them did. So we reassured that, what they are and educated. And so a lot of hand-holding and, doing one-on-one education with patients and providers as needed. So that's kind of what it all entailed.
Robert, you touched on some hurdles that we're seeing, rebate wall, the fact that really practically the only customer level impacts financially are if you're in a shared savings environment as a physician or something like that. Right. What are the current federal policies being considered or impacts to try to challenge those or just to take better uptake of biosimilars?
That's a great question. So there's legislation, there's 3 sets of legislation that was introduced in the last Congress, and I know one of them has been reintroduced, which is the physician savings model, which is incentivizes in Medicare, and if physicians prescribe a biosimilar, if there are savings associated with those, that will be shared 50-50 with the physician, the provider, basically. So it's sort of trying to incentivize use of biosimilars, especially in the Medicare space, in the Part B space. The second one was really zeroing out-of-pocket costs for Part B drugs for patients in Medicare again. So taking away any incentives, negative incentives that patients may have for not using biosimilar instead of originator. So patients will not have any out-of-pocket costs for the thing. And the third thing was really to get back to the insurance companies and incentivize them to sort of promote biosimilar usage. And, and I'm taking Kaiser out of this discussion because you guys are an anomaly that sits very differently than most other insurance, 80% of the other general population. And it's really to go to the Medicare Advantage plans and say, if you do have a promotion program that you are able to promote and grow your biosimilars, you will get an additional STAR system. Within the STAR system, you will get some benefits through the STAR program. So those 3 legislations are actively sort of being pursued on the federal side. And, hopefully they will start turning the tide. But my thing with the biosimilars is that, and you see this in the oncology space, is that whenever the payment incentives are aligned, because a lot of oncology is treated under capitated models, even on the Medicare side with oncology care models and things, physicians, pharmacists make the right decisions. They basically use the lower cost alternative. And at the end of the day, most of oncology, even on the commercial side, not even Medicare side, is on the capitated payments models. So we'll see what happens. But this is my worry. All of these cost savings models, and I've basically been involved most of the design and analysis of the cost savings model with biosimilars, hinge on two products, which is Humira and Enbrel. If we do not have a successful uptake of biosimilars in those two products, the savings model just collapsed. The reason being is that you have a $20+ billion drug in Humira, and you have another $7 or $8 billion drug in Enbrel. So if you look closely to all those savings models, the 90% of the savings hinge based on those two drugs. So we need to do something to make sure that the environment is ready next year, not next year, 2023, when the first Humira biosimilars come into the market. And there's going to be a lot of competition because 6 of them are being approved the same time, different times in the year, but 6 of them will come into the market in 2023.
Wow.
I can't imagine just a 30% savings out of 20 billion and another 30 out of 7 billion and all that going into kind of a more productive means of
Absolutely.
getting. Yeah, it's incredible.
We need to. We have no other choice, because the problem is that the industry has put itself in a situation with the therapies that they're developing, with gene therapy and all these rare disease drugs, which are fantastic. I mean, they're going to be cures, and these are going to be drugs that are life-changing, but they're going to be extremely expensive to administer. And you're not having 1 or 2 rare disease or gene therapy drugs coming in. Every company, large or small, is developing those drugs. So you're going to have a tsunami of these drugs coming at you as a health insurer, and you have to start making choices. And unless we save money on other places, like generics and biosimilars, we're not going to have enough headway, either by the government or the employers, to pay for all these wonderful therapies that are being developed.
A little more on federal policy stuff. I guess President Biden signed the Advancing Education of Biosimilars Act recently.
Right.
What does that do? How does that add to the picture here?
It just basically, it's another array of providing incentives for more education for biosimilars and also for uptake. And it's part of this bipartisan effort trying to sort of induce the marketplace to sort of have an uptake. The other thing that is important to note, Paul, and this was discussed about pricing, it's not just 30% below price. If you look at the data, when biosimilars have been introduced into the market, they put pressure on the originator price to also come down.
Yeah.
So it's not just the differential that you need to look at. You need to look at where, for example, a Remicade was prior to biosimilars and where it is now, which is about 40 or 50% below in ASP, average sales price. So that's also an incentive that needs to be taken into consideration. Just having competitive market reduces the prices, puts price pressure on these drugs.
What other treatments can we be expecting, I guess, for the whole panel to be coming forward? You obviously hit on Humira and one other. What else is in the works here that physicians could be looking for, should keep an eye out for their patients?
I can tell you insulin is one that's going to have to come up, and there's going to be a lot of competition in the insulin market. And then it's the MS drug, basically, is the other one. Multiple sclerosis drugs.
Well, we're hitting up 45 minutes or so. Does anybody else have anything that they want to add? Other comments, Dr. Singh?
Yeah, so I have a question. I find Robert's answers very interesting. Now, what about, because a lot of medications, a lot of companies will actually try to modify, change the medication a little in some form to extend their pricing advantage. Can you explain a little bit about that, and what are we doing about that from a policy standpoint?
I don't know if you and I are thinking the same thing, but there's something similar to this going on in the biosimilar. So for some odd reason, when ACA and BPCI came into effect, they changed the definition of potency to equal efficacy, the way they look at it. And that's a problem, because what initially was that potency didn't matter, right? If you had 5 milligrams in a 500 milliliter, 5 versus 100 milliliter, didn't matter. It was basically 5 milligrams that you were giving patients, but that definition was changed by the FDA. FDA is very aware of that, and they're trying to make sure that doesn't happen, because what you can see happening, what you just alluded to, is that companies can start changing and shifting what is it called? I just mentioned the word, which is a concentration. And by doing that, they can basically try to say that these are different drugs. And according to FDA definition, they are different drugs. So that potency is something that we need to look out for, and something that I hope people will lobby that the FDA goes back to the original definition of potency, which is irrelevant to efficacy. That the 5 milligram, 100 milliliter, 5 milligram, 500 milliliter is still 5 milligrams. So.
All righty. I'm going to pop in here and say, okay, we hit on a lot of policy implications. We've hit on some of the science, use, I guess, some physicians. Any other topics here? We've hit on, I think, educating our colleagues to, why to use biosimilars, what concerns or not concerns they don't need to have. Any final thoughts, Rebecca?
Having been in the trenches of switches from reference to biosimilars, I can tell you we don't see any more switchbacks to biosimilar to reference than we see if we were to switch Lipitor to atorvastatin. The rates are, and the literature, shows that ever with the real world studies. And, when you talk to patients, once you explain the concept and, the fact that their dollars will go further by being on this product and their disease state's going to be just as well managed, they're very grateful to know and grateful for us, switching to the biosimilar. And then on the provider end, they want what's best for the patient, both in terms of safety and efficacy, and the organization and the healthcare in general. And so I think it's just, once we have our incentives aligned, which has been alluded to in this talk, I think, the education gap and everything else we can bridge pretty quickly. But I think we do need that policy piece to make sure everyone's incentives are well aligned. And then, it's pretty easy to bring everyone together once that piece is there, because everyone wants to do the right thing, but we just have to have the right infrastructure for it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Dr. Singh. Closing thoughts? You're muted.
Yeah, really, again, from the clinician's perspective, it's really the trust with the pharmacist and the fact that we just want to make sure it works for our patient. Bottom line, we're looking at the cost, but the main thing, our focus really still is on the patient. And if the patient, it works for the patient, that's what we're looking for.
Great. Robert.
Incentives matter. And we need to create the incentives in the marketplace, and education, without a doubt, education is very important, but we need to create incentives in the marketplace for people to do it and fix laws where they may prohibit use of biosimilars, like what I talked about with the potency issue.
Yeah, no, as the more policy person of the other three on this panel, I heard that from you a lot, and that's kind of where we need to focus on some of the advocacy and some of the changes we have. I'm sad to say it sounds like kind of relying on insurance companies and incentivizing that direction, which isn't my favorite part of advocacy. I'd rather work on other ends.
Same here.
Right. I rather work with our other partners. Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank the three of you for being part of the first SDCMS webinar that we've done in probably a decade or something like that. But hopefully these will be a regular series, and again, on a bunch of different topics. I hope for all the attendees out there, it was interesting and useful. And thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.